Please welcome Linda LaScola.
Testing? Oh, great. Thank you very much, Rob. I'm very happy to be with you today. Thanks for inviting me. Rob has given a great introduction, but I want to start out for the time that it's just me speaking here and not some other people, to answer some of the questions that people have asked me over the last 9 years when I started conducting this study. And they said things like, how did you ever think to conduct a study of non-believing clergy, of all things? And Rob explained some of that in that I decided, this was after a trip that I took to Italy, not for the first time, actually it was my third time, but I noticed how beautiful everything was and how religion had inspired so much of the beauty that I was seeing in Italy. And I realized that I didn't really know very much about religion. I knew what I had learned in catechism many years ago as a little Catholic girl, and I had drifted away from religion very easily, as many people do in adolescence. So I became interested in it, and as I studied, I learned some things that really didn't add up to me, and I wanted to know more about it. People ask me, how did you find these people? Non-believing clergy? I mean, really? And the answer to that is that it was not easy finding them. And that's why we did a pilot study to start out, because we thought it would be very difficult to find them. We knew a guy, we being Daniel Dennett, whom I approached to do the study. I figured if I was going to do something like this, it had to have a big name behind it. And before I had done this kind of study, I had done many studies over the years, qualitative research, which most people know by focus groups. Anyone ever participate in a market research study in a focus group? I knew there's always a few in every crowd. You probably hear a lot about them now in terms of the political work that's being done. They say people have been focus groups, or the focus groups tell us this or that. Well, I had done work, much of it in the mental health field or in social issues. I'd done some political, some political research as well. But to do this kind of research, it was really my own idea, and I needed to have somebody behind me. And I selected Daniel Dennett because he had written a book called Breaking the Spell, Religion is a Natural Phenomenon. And in that book, he suggested doing research with clergy. He wanted research with clergy and research about religion to be done in the same way that research had been done on sex by Masters and Johnsons in the 50s. Before that, it had been a taboo subject and research was not done on it. And religion is or was very much the same way, so he wanted objective research. So I approached him, and to make a long story short, we started to conduct the research. But we needed to find the people first, so we started out going to a guy named Dan Barker. Does that name sound familiar to anyone? He is the head of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. He is a former pastor himself. And in his travels around the country, he would run into people who would say, you know, I used to be a pastor too, and I gave it up. And he had a list of these people. And occasionally he had somebody call him on the phone because he'd written this book, and it would be a clergy person saying, you know, I'm in the clergy right now. I'm like you were, and I don't know what to do about it. You know, can you help me? Would you talk to me? And he would talk with them, but there wasn't much he could do for them. But then when our study was in the making, he would say, well, you know, there is this woman named Linda LaScola who's working with this guy you may have heard of named Dan Dennett, who's conducting a small study right now. Maybe you could participate in that. So that's how we got some of our first participants, as well as from a group called the Center for Progressive Christianity, which you may have heard of as well. It was headed up by my old pastor, Jim Adams. I attended an Episcopal church for many years with my husband, Art, who's sitting right there in the front row. And Jim Adams was himself an agnostic, which you're able to do in the Episcopal church. And he just provided a list of names of people in his organization without saying, without any knowledge of what exactly their beliefs were. So we did this pilot study with 5 Protestant pastors, and we published that. And it made, to me, it was a big hit because my research in the past had always been very private, and it never was published. And for anyone to read it and be impressed by it was quite a surprise to me. When it became well known, then lots of clergy started contacting me and Dan Dennett and saying, you're really kind of describing what's happened to me, and we would be interested in participating in this study as well. When people ask me, they say, what are they like? After I've done this study and give talks, they're trying to figure out, they want like 3 sentences to describe what non-believing clergy are like. And it's impossible to do that because they're all different. Think of yourselves. I'm assuming many of you have had a religious journey. Perhaps some of you were not raised in religion. Perhaps some of you were fundamentalists or Roman Catholic or sort of a wishy-washy kind of Protestant. I'm not mentioning the Unitarians because that's a different category. And you're not all alike, and neither were they. I'll give you some sense of what they were like, okay? They did have some things in common. What they had in common, obviously, was they had made the same career choice. And people who are in the same line of work tend to have a few things in common. In the case of the clergy, they had very noble motives. They carefully decided to enter clergy. It's not something you just fall into. They had certain skills and personality traits. Generally, at least the ones I met, they were good people. They were compassionate. They were good listeners and good talkers. They were socially at ease. And in many cases, they were musically talented as well. Their politics, well, I talked to fundamentalists and liberals and so forth. Wherever they started out, once they changed their beliefs, they became more liberal, which I suppose is no surprise to the people here. Another thing they had in common is they did not act on their early doubts. They all had doubts, which is an acceptable thing in religion. It's acceptable among clergy to have doubts, but the idea is your doubts will come back to faith again. In their case, ultimately the doubts did not come back to faith. They put their doubts aside, or they compartmentalized them. And then at some point, they kept quiet about what was going on with themselves. They kept the doubt to themselves. They wouldn't tell their colleagues. They would, if they told anybody, they would choose that person very carefully. Sometimes it would be a spouse, and sometimes it would absolutely not be a spouse, because that could cause huge problems in the marriage. And it was a slow process to non-belief. They tried to put it out of their minds. They didn't think about it for years. Something in a sermon they gave or something they read from the Bible would get them thinking. The more they spent time watching people die or comforting people while they would die, they would have more and more doubts and be more and more difficult for them to say what they were expected to say. But it took a long time for them to reach non-belief. The differences among them I can go through very quickly because there's the differences that are among any of us. It depended on, everyone has a different childhood and different influences in their childhood, so that affects how you feel later on. In adolescence, they can be very affected by a person. There are a few people in the study. There were 35 people in the ultimate study we did all together. There were some of them who say, religion saved me. It saved me when I was an adolescent. I was lost. I was in trouble with the law. My family threw me out, and I found Jesus, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. But then later on, when they lost their belief, they gave that up. In the young adulthood, if people had not made a decision about their career, by that time most of them did, and that's when they decided to go into the clergy. Sometimes it was because of social justice work. Sometimes they truly felt a calling. They'd had a spiritual experience and felt a calling and wanted to be part of the ministry. In terms of family issues, some had very supportive spouses, and some did not. And that made all the difference in the world. It's very difficult to come out and change everything in your life if your spouse is supportive, and almost impossible if they're not. And then you have all the issues of supporting a family to consider. In terms of the paths toward non-belief, they would start reading and investigating, but not necessarily the same stuff. There's one guy who only read the Bible. It took him 10 years, not because he's a slow reader, but because he would put it down for years at a time. And when he completed it, he said, what did he call it? He said, this is like a load of trash. This is, it didn't make any sense to him. It's a bunch of bunk was the term he used, a bunch of bunk. This is a Baptist minister. Others went the scientific route. One guy took all the books out of the library. He lived in a small town, and he was getting books from, having them sent to him from libraries all over the state to read all sorts of scientific things. And others learned it just from years in ministry, listening to people talk about things, listening to their own sermons sometimes. They just didn't believe what they were saying after a while. And then finding a way out is something they all handled differently. For some people, it was relatively easy. If they had another skill that they could if they had a job opportunity from a friend. And others, it was incredibly difficult, and still is. There are a lot of people I know of who are in ministry right now who wish they weren't there. Rob, you keeping track of the time? Okay, thanks. People often ask, what's happening next with this? And something that happened that I was not at all prepared for was something called the Clergy Project. Have any of you heard of the Clergy Project? Okay. It was started by Dan Barker, whose name I mentioned, Richard Dawkins, who's another name I think you know of. Richard and Dan met at a conference a few years ago, and Richard was very impressed with the talk Dan Barker gave about his experience as clergy. And they said, we ought to get a group together, some kind of a group, where these people can all get together and talk about their experiences and maybe help each other. And then Dan Dennett and I did the study, and suddenly we had a whole list of names of people. As I mentioned, I interviewed 35 people, but the study was a very open-ended, qualitative study, and I wanted certain kinds of people in it. So there are many people who would have qualified for the study, but let's say if I had chosen the people who most wanted to be in it, I would have done a study of 35 Southern Baptists, because there are a lot of them. I could have done the whole study in the South, but I wanted to do the study all over the country. So we had these people that we knew about, and we started the Clergy Project with the 3 people I mentioned, and then 2 non-believing clergy, one named Adam and one named Chris. Both of them had contacted me about the study, and both of them had contacted Dan Barker earlier. So he contacted them, and we all helped put the Clergy Project together. This was in 2011. It started with 52 members. I had offered about half of them, and Dan Barker the other half. And there's now 700 members of the Clergy Project. And it's a private online community that's meant to help clergy. You go through a screening process in order to be part of it. And they now have an outplacement program, and several people have been helped by the outplacement program. Although I founded the Clergy Project, I'm not a member of it because I'm not clergy. So though I was very involved in setting the whole thing up, I now just keep in touch with it through various members. And if you want to know more about the Clergy Project, you can go to the website. They now have a public website that people can learn about it. And if you're an interested member of the clergy, you can ask there to be interviewed to become a member of the private group. And there are 2 other things happening. One is I have a blog on the Patheos channel. Has anyone ever heard of the Friendly Atheist? It's the most popular atheist blog. And they're on the Patheos channel. The Patheos channel is a whole raft of blogs about religion. And guess which one is the most popular and brings in the most revenue? It's the atheist channel. I think it's not so much that there are more atheists out there, I think it's more people interested in hearing about it. And the name of the blog that I operate is called Rational Doubt. And I'm the editor of the blog, and most people who write for the blog are members of the Clergy Project or other non-believing clergy. So I invite you to tune into that Rational Doubt on the Pathos channel. And Rob mentioned briefly, and I won't go into it here, but there's a play underway, a play in development by the very clever title of Caught in the Pulpit. And when my colleague Daniel Dennett started to read the transcripts that I had of the people I had interviewed, his first thought was, this is drama, and we could make this into a great play. So that's what's happening right now. And you can read more about that also if you go to the Rational Doubt blog. It's in development. We hope to find a producer, and maybe next year at this time you'll get together a group of your organization and go to see a production of Caught in the Pulpit in a Richmond theater somewhere. We can only hope for that. When we were planning this program, when Rob and I were planning it, at one point we hoped to, we thought we would read excerpts from the transcripts that I had done. I had done that in other talks. And then, as Rob thought about it, he came across 3 people who are part of this group, who are like real live people, who have gone through this process themselves, or in different parts of this process themselves. So instead of doing transcripts, we're going to have some real live people come up. And I think we're ready for the real live people right now.
It should be on. So I think we were going to start with Sylvio. I think the order we're going to do, we're going to have Sylvio, is that correct?
Yes.
So we're going to have Sylvio Lynch come up for a few minutes, and then Jeanne, and then Tom. Then we're going to actually have all of them have a conversation together, and then after all of that, we'll take some audience questions for the last 20 minutes or so. So if you can slide a chair for it too. Thank you.
So I just met Sylvio this morning. And the reason Sylvio's asked to participate, and very graciously agreed to, is because he was one of the types that I interviewed in the study. He was someone who went to seminary and either didn't complete seminary, in his case he completed it, at Virginia Union University here in Richmond, or completed seminary and they decided not to go into the ministry. Now, from my layperson's perspective, my lapsed Catholic layperson's perspective, after I learned about what people learned in seminary, I couldn't imagine how anyone could learn that and keep on going to be a minister. But that's not the effect it had on most people. Most people learn it and they go on into the ministry, into religious life in some way. So Sylvio is going to help us understand how some of that happened. Now, in your case, you decided to go to seminary, and tell us some of what you learned there and the effect it had on you.
Yes, I decided to attend the School of Theology at Virginia Union University. And as you very well know, in the African American community, as far as Christianity is concerned, that's one of the top theological universities for African Americans to attend in the country. Now, in the African American tradition, in terms of ministers, the primary focus is put on the pastor in terms of his relationship and symbolism of Jesus. During the time I was in seminary, as I began to learn more about how the Bible was put together and more about the background on the history of Christianity, it came to me, especially in passing and working within the churches, that we were learning one thing in seminary, but when you came to bring that information to the churches, it was not welcome. And on one experience, I was told, Brother Lynch, we know that what you're saying is true, and you've learned this in seminary, but the people are not ready for this yet. On one occasion, I had made a statement about how the Bible had come together. Many times it happened. And so I'd get remarks that, well, you sound more like an atheist. And the whole point of the matter, what I came to understand was that there's this mythological idea about how religion and Jesus and all of these things have come together. And so after a period of time, I decided, especially knowing and realizing at some point I was going to have to take ordination and take a vow that I could not say words I did not believe in. And for me as an African American and being in the community, there's nothing worse than conceding that you don't have an interest in religion, whether it's you're not interested in Islam or any religion at all. That's worse than even committing and saying that you're a homosexual, which I'm not. But in the black community and in the black church, that's a no-no. And so having to reconcile that within myself and thinking about what my responsibility would be, I had to decide whether I would be faithful to myself. And some person say, well, if you're going to be an atheist or not believe, what will you say if there is a God? I said, well, at least I would have lived a life according to what I thought to be true, what I truly believed in, rather than to profess to believe something that I really didn't. So we have a lot of pretending that goes on. So for me personally, it was a great experience, great teachers, but I do think that part of my issue was having to get all of that training. And these priests get an amazing amount of information, but by the time it comes to the parishes, the people really don't get it. And so, because they really can't say to the people what is really going on. I remember one discussion I had with the idea of consubstantiation and transubstantiation. And so it's like, what are you talking about here? Well, by the time you explain what one believes is symbolism, and in the Roman Catholic Church, it believes that the wine actually turns into the blood and body of Christ. And people are looking at you like, what are you talking about? And in the African American community, maybe this is not really explained. And then when you look upon black ministers, and sometimes black people in general, you think everybody's the same or monolithic. Some could think that we're the same or monolithic. But there are a number of African Americans who are atheists, many who don't believe, many who have, yes ma'am.
Yeah, let me interrupt you for a minute, because you talk, the people said, asked you if you were an atheist. At the time, the answer, even though you were taking what you were learning differently than perhaps some, you were not an atheist.
No, not at that time.
You didn't think of yourself that way at all. In fact, not for decades later.
Over a period of time, right around the 1990s, I began to I think I learned more after seminary, because I tried to complete seminary while I was working for the Norfolk Southern Railroad full time. I worked there 14 years. And then I later on to work in public education here in Richmond for 22 years with at-risk students. That's what I later on went to do in terms of serving. But when I began to see and look behind some of the images, if you go into some African American churches, you may see some of the images, say for example, like Warner Salmon's Head of Christ. And I kept wondering, who is this guy? This doesn't make sense here. And so, fortunately, the Christian Century, which is a regular magazine, I think it's still published, one day in 1990, right around August. And I saw this image, and it gave the history of how Warner Salmon had put this image out, especially around World War II, and had given it to the soldiers, and it looked so familiar to me, and I suddenly realized this was that little card they gave me in Sunday school and told me it was Jesus. Of course, it is not. It's simply an image that he had developed, and so I think something like over 500 billion copies have been made. So, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we talk about, I want to talk about how people react to things differently. So here he is in seminaries having these questions. He's taken all in, from what I hear, really appreciated learning all this information and wanted to share it with people in the church. And this is a story that I heard frequently in the study that I did, that people are actually quite excited in seminary. They're not necessarily expecting to learn what they do.
Exactly.
But when they learn it, their thought was not, how can I possibly believe this? That's not their thought. Their thought is, this is interesting. I want to go and tell other people. And the professors, if I remember what you said, this also applied to people in the study, that you can't exactly go to your professors and say, this doesn't add up to me. It's more a matter of learning how to integrate it into your belief system.
Yes, and be able to impart that in a way wherein if there's specific tradition or understanding in each church, whether it's Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, or whatever. There's a specific way that it has to be delivered to the parishioner. And so you have to feel comfortable within yourself in being able to do that. And that kind of knowledge and that kind of ability, I think, requires a very special person, especially if you've decided, I mean, for me personally, the dilemma was, could I deliver messages to persons that I personally really didn't believe in? Could I deliver information that I factually did not care for myself or did not believe? And the answer to that is no. But there's another question, she and I were discussing this beforehand, and whether you're talking about politics or social issues, there's a general question that I think needs to be asked, and that is, do we really want an open discussion on the issues, whether it's race or religion? And I'll tell you quite frankly, in general, what I've learned, no, we don't want to talk about it openly. We don't want to discuss it. We don't want the details of it, because once we know the details, that means we have to change. And that's where change comes in. Someone asks you, well, what do you really think about? Someone asks you your opinion. Well, Mr. Lynch, what do you think about X, Y, and Z? Then when you tell them, they don't like you anymore. You see, that's the dilemma that we're in. But I think the exciting part about this is it's not easy, but for me personally, I think the idea of being free to accept the fact, well, I'm this particular way. And if I can accept myself unconditionally in my own thoughts and beliefs, and I can look at others too in the same way. We're not all alike.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. Yes, ma'am.
Let me tell a story of a minister who was similar to you in seminary, but he had a whole different story afterwards. He was learning all this stuff, and he was aware, he became an atheist in seminary. But he decided to continue on. And some of his friends couldn't understand how he could do that. But he felt there was a value to being with people and speaking to them in their language at times when they really needed him. He became the minister of a progressive Methodist church in a progressive part of the country. And he, in his mind, he is teaching them to be humanists. Now, he uses all of the Christian language, but he doesn't say, I believe this, and you should believe that. He said, Jesus teaches such and such. And when he first told me this, I wasn't quite sure that he was being honest with himself. But I think it's his personality and the way he's doing it. And I think he's doing actually much better for the world than a preacher who doesn't believe what he's saying and says it anyhow, or someone who has not examined themselves as much as this person has. And I guess a continuing point that I want to make is that people are very, very different from each other. And what seems right to one person isn't necessarily the right way to do it. There's more than one right way to do it. And you found what's right for you, and that's something that you're comfortable with. You could not continue on after seminary. You just couldn't do it.
I decided not to take ordination because I couldn't honestly convey those ideas knowing that I didn't believe in it. It's just like someone may say to you, you say, well, tell me the truth. Don't tell me the truth, just lie to me so I can feel it. And I just didn't have that in me, and I still don't. And I think that's helped me as a person personally, because I used to have a great deal more of my own personal bias and prejudice. But when I suddenly realized that what I may think about others is unfairly thought about without knowing the background of what they are like inside, their feelings, try to see it from their point of view, and that I don't have the answers. And if someone is saying, well, you know, Brother Lynch, come to me and tell me, you know, I talked to Jesus this morning, and you know, I'm saying to myself, well, you know, maybe you need to see a psychiatrist. Because in general in the African American community, there's a serious no about whether or not you take your troubles to the altar to Jesus, rather than maybe go see a counselor or a psychiatrist. Now, not just our community, it's predominant there, but in the African American community, mental health is kind of a denial between the religious faith in going to Jesus or God to get it resolved, or going to a doctor. And often kids, some friends of mine, I say, well, if you're hit by an ambulance out on the street, would you rather us call the doctor or call a priest? You know, what do you want? You want a minister to help? So I think there's a rational way of thinking about it, but I do think this out of a deep respect for others' belief. Some people need that.
Right.
And it's not my role to try to take that from them.
Right. I'm thinking of another person in this study. I called him Stan. He started out as a Baptist, and he had doubts and serious questions in seminary, but his reaction was to think, well, I don't understand it now, but everybody else seems to see and understand what's going on, and maybe it will come to me later. Mm-hmm. So he kept up with it. He kept on with it. And then his reaction when he couldn't really do the biblical inerrancy thing anymore, he went on and he got more education. He already had his master's in divinity. He got more education so he could switch to a liberal religion. And so he did that, and that worked up for him for a while. And then he just couldn't get into the myth thing, and that didn't work with him. He tried and tried and tried. He became a military chaplain, which is being a chaplain, in my estimation at least, is a little easier because you're usually not dealing with a congregation and you're working with people in great need, and your main role is to comfort them, and you use religion, whatever their religion is, to comfort them. So he did that for a while and was happy, and finally he couldn't take that anymore either, and now he's a social worker. He got out of the military. I was lucky to have the GI Bill and was lucky to have an understanding wife, and he's a clinical social worker. And he's in his 40s, and he's a very happy guy. So there's a lot of different things going on out there. Rob, how are we doing on time? Should we move? Okay. All right. Thanks very much. And all right. Thank you.
This is the hot chair.
Yes, this is it. Now everybody knows Jeanne, is that right?
Not
Okay.
everybody.
Okay, she's a senior minister of this church. And you know that she started out, well, at least in your religious career, as a Catholic nun.
Mm-hmm. I did.
And tell us about I just met Jeanne this morning. We had a Zoom conversation on the internet a couple of weeks ago, but this is the first time we had to talk personally.
So my history is pretty straightforward. I was born into a Catholic family, and were members of a Catholic parish, and there were 5,000 people in the parish. You know, it was a whole village. It had schools. It had all sorts of stuff. You never had to go outside of the church very often, except for groceries, you know. And even then, you might buy them from somebody who was a member of the church. And growing up, I loved being a part of it. I didn't particularly embrace the artifice of the theology, transubstantiation, you know, all these things. I was kind of agnostic on the question of God or no God.
But you went on to become a sister.
Well, it's important to understand that as I was growing up, the liberal Catholic Church, the Berrigan brothers were protesting the war. Other folks were doing lots of activism against nuclear armament. There were all kinds of things that were very real and wonderful and good work. And if you hung out in that end of the church, you could do really good work, and nobody had compulsory belief systems there. I don't know what people believed. In fact, to this day, I think if you pick any random religious group, you won't be able to find two people who believe the same thing. That mythology that people can embrace a creed is, to me, a big myth.
See, in that, I want to just point out again that this is quite different. And Jeanne says that this is like the way the people in her parish thought. And if I were to try to characterize the way the people in my parish thought, I would say it was completely different from what you're describing.
Well, I'm only talking about the left liberal end
Right.
of the Catholic Church.
You know, I understand that.
Orthodoxy on the right end is pretty constraining. But even then, among them, people interpreted things very differently, and if you got people into a conversation, you'd find out that they actually didn't believe the same things.
Yeah, and in my case, people never really got into that conversation. They were just, this is the catechism, this is what you learn, this is what you believe.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I did fine. When I was about 11 or 12, I started to realize I didn't believe, there were maybe a few words in the creed that I really believed, but I just didn't say it anymore. And that never was an issue. And I decided to enter the convent because I could do some good, which was important. And there was no ministry opportunity for me as a woman in the Catholic Church, but there was community in religious life, which is a system of accountability.
And all the prayers and so forth didn't bother you and all that?
The prayers are ritual, and they bring you into the chapel in the morning, in which you are reciting some psalms and you're doing it together, and then you have a lot of quiet time. And that was always valuable time to me for reflection and self-examination. And I just preached a little while ago on the need to really look at what you're doing in your life. Well, that doesn't happen when you fill every moment. So I was quite comfortable taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And everyone always thinks chastity must be the hard one. It's not necessarily. It's obedience is very hard. You're not obedient to folks on the earth. The idea is to try to align yourself with the will of God, which to me can also mean goodness on this earth, which is what we're called to serve, I think. So I was comfortable there.
Okay, so you were happy, would you have called yourself, or would you describe yourself as an agnostic during that time?
Yeah, I probably would, because I am a believer that nobody's got proof anyway.
Well, as you mentioned I'll take another aside, because often people think that the difference between an agnostic and an atheist is that an agnostic doesn't know and an atheist does. And most atheists will tell you that they don't know that there's not a God. They just don't believe in a God. And one of the findings, and one of the things I've read in many places, is that it's almost an individual thing what you want to call yourself, what you feel comfortable with. But it's actually incorrect to if you're not an atheist, to say that an atheist knows there's not a God, because an atheist won't say that about themselves.
I though think that there's a value in intentionally being agnostic, because that potentially can create a position to be open to all conversations with all people. And I think that's an important characteristic for us to try to embrace, at least in some dimension. And I think Jewish tradition teaches this, and that they never write out the whole name of God, because that would be ridiculous. It would presume that they understood what God was. I've always respected that teaching.
Now, so you were in the convent. Did you ever get in conversations with other sisters about what people believed?
Oh, sure, lots. And most of them, by far, were far more orthodox than I, though they were liberal in their social justice outlooks mostly. But put two people in a room and you've got two different theologies, right?
No. It sounds like you were not troubled by your difference in belief.
There were lots of things to be troubled with in the Catholic Church, but things like hierarchy and misogyny and sexism, and I mean, there were a lot of things to be troubled about. I didn't have time or worry about the other things.
It wasn't you, it doesn't sound like, either. I mean, I think I know some people are troubled by the beliefs of the church, but you're not one of them. You're troubled by other things in the church.
Yeah, I just didn't believe all those things, and yet I felt deeply a part of it. I felt embraced. I think that there is that place to exist in most churches. I'm always a little surprised that ministers are shocked to find out they don't believe what their congregations believe. I assume that's the case. They've been through a lot more education. How could they possibly be in the exact same place as congregants who are strung along a continuum anyway?
Yeah, I kind of agree with that based on what I've seen and what I've studied, I think it's more hopeful on the part of the ministers. They want them to believe. They want them to understand. And that was not an issue that for you, perhaps in part because you did not have a congregation. I mean, that was, you were not dealing with people in that, lay people in that intimate way.
You still work in parishes and you still have those relationships. And you're still an authority figure. If I can just tell a little funny story, a friend of mine, her mother passed away, and she was a college friend of mine, and I went to the wake. You know, we were burying her body the next day. And when I arrived, I wore my habit. She had requested that I wear my habit, and I arrived. And they immediately, when I arrived, like the Red Sea parted, and I came in, and they said, "Sister, will you lead us in the rosary?" Well, you need to know that, like, my skill set on the rosary, because I never prayed that, never cared to pray it. Marian devotion was not my thing. And this is in the day before the internet, so, you know, you can't, like, whip this up. And so I went to the funeral director, and I said, "Tell me what the first 5 decades of the rosary are." And I wrote them down, and then I put them in an obscure little place, and I prayed the rosary with them. You know, for them, this is devotion that I needed to respect. That's not the time where you say, "Hey, where did you guys get this whole idea about Marian worship?" You know, it's the fourth person of the Holy Trinity, you know, in the Catholic Church. So that's not the time or way. And then the next day, one of the aunts who suspected I wasn't facile at this came in to dinner, and she said, "You don't pray the rosary much, do you?" And I said, "You caught me." And she said, "Well, what do you do?" I picked up the Bible and I opened to the Psalms, and I said, "This is one of my favorite ones." It was one of those Psalms where it's like, "God, I'm really pissed with you." And then, you know, it was okay. We had an understanding.
Interesting story. And something I would have never guessed about a nun.
Well, most of the nuns are far more liberal than the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Far more.
Yes,
liberal.
and we've learned some of that recently from the nuns in the bus and so forth. And in the few minutes we have left, I just want to talk briefly about, you did leave the convent.
I did.
Here you are.
When John Paul II was elected Pope, this was an arch-conservative directional move in the church. The prior Pope was very liberal and progressive, and then we went the other direction. And he was a young enough man that I knew that for most of my time in the convent, he was going to be there. And you have to look at things and you have to say, okay, am I going to stay here and fight all the time? I'm not that person. I'm a builder-upper person. I'm not a fight, be angry, critique, meanness. I don't like that. So I thought about it for about 6 months, and then I decided it was time to leave. And when I left, the only thing that was holding me to the Catholic Church was the community of people I was in relationship to. When I left that, I was soon out of the Catholic Church and on my own and searching. And I searched for a long time, but never, you know, I kept going into churches and synagogues and finding a fair degree of nonsense that was unacceptable. Until I walked into a Unitarian church and I got the message that my brain was invited to attend. And I thought, wow, reason, imagine. And I just fell in love with it, and after just a little bit, I decided this is for me.
You know, there's a reason why there are no Unitarians in the study that I conducted. For one thing, none of them came forward. None of them said, "Oh, I want to talk to somebody about how difficult it has been for me coming to terms with religion," because that's not the way it often happens with Unitarians.
No, we have ministers spread along the theological world. You know, they're just all over the place. And the real requirement for this ministry is to respect other people's beliefs, whatever they may be.
Right. And another thing that happened, it was several of the interviews I had with people. At the end of the interviews, and we often did 3-hour-long interviews, so I got to know the people very well. I would say, "Well, you know, I understand you want to get out of the situation you're in. Have you considered being a Unitarian minister?"
Oh, you're the one.
That's how they come to you.
No, I'm joking.
And I would get a reaction. Sometimes the reaction would be, if it were in the Deep South, for instance, Unitarian, like what's that? They had heard of it, but they didn't really know what it was. And then I would explain it to them, and I would explain it in a very objective way. And I feel I knew something about the Unitarians because my husband has belonged to Unitarian congregations for 20 years or something like that, off and on. And the reaction would be, "Oh, I'm done." They didn't. These people I was talking to, these are like the fundamentalists. They just wanted out.
Yeah.
They didn't want to have anything more to do with religion. They maybe would want to be in charge of humanist community, which truthfully didn't really exist when the study started. There are some now. And Unitarianism often is a humanist community.
We have humanists, but we also have theists, we have
Right.
Buddhists, we have, in practice, they're all Unitarians, but they have different practices.
Right. And they didn't want that. They were done with religion. They either wanted to just leave it completely behind or focus on not being religious anymore. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. This is Tom David Siebert, who is currently, hi.
Hi.
We met last night. We had a chance to talk for about an hour. We also were on the Zoom conversation. It looks much better in person, I might add, than on the, on the Zoom conversation. Something about the beard. The internet does something to your beard. I don't know. And we're very happy to have him here with us today. He's given a lot of thought to coming today, and we talked about it. Both Rob and I, as happy as we were to hear about him and his story, I've made it very clear that there is no obligation for him to be part of it today, but he really wants to. And what I got from Tom David from speaking to him last night is that he's a very interesting combination of ambivalence and resolve. He has described himself as a believer, and he explains that, and I'll let him do that, and also a beneficiary, and I'll let you explain that as well.
Well, my goodness, here I am. I'll Shanghai a little passage of scripture to say, "Here am I, reason, I come to do your will." My seminary classmates would be dumbfounded that I'm in this position in life and sitting on this stage today. And yes, ambivalence and resolve. As I was thinking about that after we chatted a little earlier, maybe not ambivalence. Maybe that's not quite the word. Hesitation, certainly. Only because of the awareness of the possibility or the risk of injury that being here might effect in people I work with, not really so much in my little parish community, but in my day profession as a chaplain to kids and families who are suffering generally from cancer or sickle cell, and the very delicate, fragile relationship that obtains in that kind of situation. So that's my hesitancy. I'm one of those kids who was born to be in the church. Although I was born into a family of a father who never went to church. Family was non-observant, nominatively Protestant, I guess Lutheran. A mother who was a fallen away Catholic, having broken with the church when a priest told her she would go to hell when she was in the hospital, having had her third child and saying that she didn't think they would have any more, and yes, she would use contraception. and she never went back. I was the outlier in my family. My brother and sister were never religiously oriented. I was just the weird kid in the mix. When I was finally baptized at the age of 7 in a Protestant church, a congregational one, at the instance of some neighbors that I guess got evangelical and got to my mom and said, well, you should bring the kids to our church. And there I went for some years until a fellow who turned out to be my best friend through much of my grade school years was Roman Catholic, and I started going to church with him, and wow, I was just really quite taken with the whole liturgical milieu. And so the sense of interest and vocation that I had been aware of from early childhood and in a Protestant context to be a minister then just naturally transitioned into becoming a priest. And as I became more and more involved in a Roman Catholic parish, I had the opportunity to really see the priesthood at close hand. I became one of those boys who, in Catholic lore, was known as a rectory rat. Answered the door and the telephone and just did all kinds of whatnot that needed to be done.
It was natural to you.
It was natural to me. It was a natural atmosphere. It was a second home. I felt a sense of place there. And of course that eventuated into going into seminary and so on. I was always a questioning sort, though, not having been a cradle Catholic, I guess, and something having taken in me of the Protestant, the protestation, the quest for reforming, always did serve me in being able to question things along the way, but never to the point that it did on the night of my ordination, when I was about the work of filling out the oaths, the solemn oaths that somebody about to enter into major orders is required to complete. And it is word for word. You have to write it out. It's basically a statement of adherence. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, and kind of all that religious dogma. And then going on into what you believe about the church, and in Roman Catholicism, of course, the Pope has pride of place, that you accept the role of the Pope and his magisterium and his infallibility, and that not only do you accept everything that Holy Mother Church proposes to be believed with religious faith and adherence now, but what she may propose in the future. And you have to write this out by hand, copy it by hand. And I really struggled with that, and I said, I don't know that I can do this. And my mentor said, well, if you don't do this, they're not going to ordain you tomorrow. I thought, okay, and I practiced mental reservation. With a lot of it. And I signed it. I said, I've got too much invested in this, and there is too much that I want to do and believe I can do as a priest.
Let me ask you something, Tom. Did you talk with any of the other people being ordained at that time, or was it just you?
No.
Okay, because one of the Catholic priests in the study that Dan Dennett and I conducted had the exact same experience. And I wonder if it's not pretty common. I wouldn't be surprised if it's something about being asked to just write the whole thing out.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like right before you're going to be ordained. If you don't do it, then everything that you've worked for is gone. And I think it's maybe a moment where they catch you
Yes. Well, I mean, and maybe it's not true in Protestant denominations, but I mean, within Roman Catholicism, there is that sense of relationship to the church as this pseudo-divine entity, I mean, as the mediator, and one submits one's intellect, in religious submission to the teaching magisterium of the church. And that wasn't a terribly difficult thing for me to do, in the sense that I had such respect for, the eminent early fathers and mothers and all of those who had formulated the corpus of Catholic doctrine and life in this incredibly complex edifice that is Roman Catholicism.
Now, when you said last night, you said you were, and it said it in a very resolute way, you said you were a believer, but you were a believer in something that that would not have been part of your ordination. What are you, how did you describe? I'm asking you to say what you said last night.
What did I say last night? I said a lot, and my mind has been just spinning ever since. No. I'm lost track here.
You are a believer in humanism, in humans, and in reason.
Well, yes, I mean, and that's, that's, of course, a more recent point of arrival. And I would say, let me say this. When Rob asked me if I would be interested in doing this, and very sensitively and delicately, as he did, recognizing that, I was perhaps putting myself at some professional risk, I thought, well, it wasn't hard for me to say yes. I felt I had to say yes to this, because this is kind of a parallel experience for me. I'm here in large part because of the drag queens at Stonewall, and all of those who were on the forefront of fighting for equality for people of homosexual orientation, just in our country and across the world. I sat that struggle out in the years of my seminary. I was too busy pursuing my profession. And now I've arrived at a point of life where the religious supernatural does not supply for me. And yes, I mean, to say that I've arrived at an intellectual perspective that is atheistic is a massive transformation, and puts me within a movement. And I feel I owe it to that movement, and perhaps to others who are in my situation and are out there, to be maybe a little bit on the forefront, behind these men and women that you've interviewed, perhaps. But I think we're still rather in the early stages of this movement, at least as far as clergy are concerned.
It's early, but it's moved extremely rapidly.
Yes.
And in fact, a lot of what I've heard at conferences, for instance, from people who are both gay and atheist, is that the atheists need to take on the manners of the gay movement because it works so well for them, that just casually in conversation, whenever the opportunity arises to say, oh yes, I'm gay, or yes, I'm atheist, is the best way to do it.
So most people, if they do, they have an opportunity to come out once in life. I have the opportunity to do it twice. And so I had practiced the first time around, and although I never really stood up in front of a group and said I was gay before, and and here I am standing up in front of a group and saying I'm atheist, and I have no idea who will see this tape someday. And that was kind of my thought of, parents of kids treating the cancer sit in a hospital room for hours and days and weeks and months. And they have computers in their lap and, I Google things all the time. Oh, Tom David Siebert, yeah, I wonder about him. And so
that's your concern.
it's a huge concern for me, certainly, because, I'm in a position of trust. And, people are already at their wits' end and you can't get more emotionally vulnerable than they are. And so to have someone come into the hospital room as one who, we wear these tags, and doctor, nurse, social worker, chaplain, and that's load-bearing, of course. That can mean a lot of things to many people, for good or ill, but most people have a certain image of what a chaplain is. He's the God Squad guy coming in here. And
there is such a thing as a humanist chaplain now.
And there is, and that is very, very interesting to me and fuels me, because I've come to understand and really have had to begin to work out a new self-understanding and a platform for what it is that grounds what I do. And that it isn't the supernatural. That all of this stuff that pertains to religion is the product of the human mind, is the product of the human intellect, the product of human engagement with the existential situation that from the dawn of consciousness, we as a species have had to come to terms with. And I thank Bishop John Spong, who played a seminal role for me, because when I first went on leave of absence from the clerical life in 2001, I began to read things that I never would have bothered with, and Bishop Spong's works were among them. And it sounds silly to me to say this now, but to read something that basically said what I had said a moment ago, that that religion was created, that basically humanity was not created in the image and likeness of God, but humanity has created God in his, and in those days certainly was, only his image and likeness. And that just clicked in my mind in a way that I could never have been open to before. And, if, a beautiful tapestry or something, or they tell you that if you get a run in your sweater or your clothing, don't pull that string, because if you do, you risk unraveling it. Well, I started pulling at that string and tugging at it and yanking it, and I have basically studied myself to where I am. Reading voraciously the works of the Four Horsemen and, everybody around them. I would mention, Richard Holloway, who has great significance to me, who is
He's
the former
Scottish.
He was the former
Clergy.
presiding bishop of Scotland. Beautiful, beautiful account, of his work, and so on. So as I was thinking about this last night, as I got into bed, and for some reason I started thinking of the play A Long Day's Journey into Night, which I have long loved, and I just Googled it and and was reading about how it was kind of a autobiographical account of Eugene O'Neill's life, and all of a sudden it just struck me. I said, this whole journey for me is something. I took that title, and it's A Long Night's Journey into Day. Not that bad, that the night is bad. I love the night. Sleep, a lot of wonderful things happen in the night. Sleep we can't do without it. Deprive somebody of it in, Donald Trump's torture land, and, we know it destroys people in short order. Dreams, regeneration, and, the night is a place of wonder, and it's a place of beauty, and, it has to get dark in order to see the stars and really open up the vault of the heavens, and people make love at night, and people go out to dinner at night. So everything about my previous life I don't mean to say, was some lost, place of terror, because there was so much, as Jeanne, from my stream in, Catholicity and, as in my case, into Eastern Orthodoxy, and that's its own story. There was much of beauty and power there. And
We were talking last night as we were finishing our conversation about how much we loved about religion, and that how all I would need to say or hear somebody say would be Verdi's Requiem, and I would get chills just thinking of it, or Bach's Mass in B minor, and I would get chills just the title of it, even not being able to bring up the music. And these are perhaps evolutionary things, or good things that religion has brought, what we call religion has brought to us.
mm-hmm.
And I'd like to bring everybody into the conversation now, if I could. And we've got Tom David is actively, has chosen actively to go through something right now, and something that the two of you have experienced in your past. Not quite the same way, of course, but and when the two of you just met earlier, and you could just sort of recount some of what you said to him.
Well, I truly feel that it's kind of like getting a get-out-of-jail card. Being liberated from something that you've been in denial about for a very long time is a very freeing, I think, circumstance.
I just preached about that.
Yes. And the longer that you stay in, the more miserable that it is. It isn't easy. And there are, as you said, maybe social consequences for certain things being known, but I think that personally there's less personal persecution. I think it's like that first step in a 12-step program. But once you come out of denial and admit that you have that particular issue and you face it, I think that is the biggest part of it. But I don't think it's an end to it. I think it's an ever-evolving kind of feeling that you have about what you discover in life, and you were talking about you discussing your past life. I think that is a good thing. And if life is going to remain the same on one end and all the way to the other end, I think it's very useless. So it should change for the better, and I think you feel very good about it. At least I do, and I don't think it's anything that's already planted in stone, but I think it's something we deal with all the time, every day, and revisit it. When we see others that are dealing with certain kind of circumstances, we can kind of say, well, you know what? It might not be resolved today, but at least you're admitting that you know you need to deal with this, and you're feeling better about who you are, what you think, and how you feel about tomorrow. And you have to be optimistic about it. And I think that...
Jeanne, what were you preaching today? Oh, sure.
No, that way.
This
that
way.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Jeanne, you say you preached about this recently?
Well, I just preached today about irrational thinking and how it imprisons us, and it requires constantly more and more energy from us to maintain the irrationality, and it isolates us. You know, the more energy we have to pump into that, the less we have for anyone else, and the more energy it takes for anybody to relate to us. You know, so it's ultimately dehumanizing. And good friends come forward and tell you, wait a minute, I think we need to examine this, but sometimes people are not prepared to receive that.
Well, there's practical concerns too. I mean, people are worried about their, not just how being free intellectually, but holding down a job, keeping a job.
Yeah, I think people's marriages are at stake. Yeah, I think there's a lot at stake.
Have any words for Tom?
It's good out here. You know, a lot is the loss of the culture and the change of the culture, you know. To be deeply Catholic, you speak a whole other language.
Are there how many Catholics, former Catholics, current Catholics? A few. There was a few around. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a whole cultural package that comes with any faith, really. But the more the older the faith, the more prevalent the faith, the more powerful. I mean, the Catholic Church does everything it can to convey power. Then you go through withdrawal. You have to go through withdrawal. Mm-hmm. And so there's a sacrifice on that level. You're no longer fluent as once you were, you know. In a new environment, you have to go learn another language or another set of cultural values. And I personally feel it's worth it, but I did this when I was much younger than you, mm-hmm. and so I can understand there's some sacrifice. I can't imagine what would happen if my partner felt differently or was devoted. You know, boy, we'd have a lot of juggling to do.
Mm-hmm. In terms of Tom's job, he's a chaplain, and my understanding and my experience with chaplains is that they really have to know about all religions. And it's my personal opinion that as a chaplain, it doesn't really much matter what you believe. It matters how what you present to the people that you're dealing with.
People like Unitarian chaplains because when a Hindu comes in or mm-hmm. somebody else, my chaplain supervisor used to say, "Pupke, I've got a Native American in there, you know, I want you to," because fundamentalists wouldn't go and minister, mm-hmm. you know. So I think it's actually, if you think about it, you just expanded the number of people who could potentially think of you as someone to have a deep conversation with about what's ultimate and true in their life.
Yes, well, it's a perfect profession to be in, you know, for that reason. I mean, and it's what I love about it is that you get to do all the best of people caring, you know, at moments that at once are the worst, and later on, at least with perspective, they often come to see as some of the best moments of their life. And you know, a clergy person has entree to that, and you know, insofar as they're invited into that, and we function in a clinical environment not from, you know, our denominational stance. We're not there as a Baptist minister or a Presbyterian or a Catholic priest. It's about the person in the bed and in the room. So it certainly allows a lot of freedom. And I mean, I really understand that, you know, the human condition is where it all begins, and that's where we meet people. And all of this other stuff is the accoutrement, it's the tool bag, you know, that people use. Of course, you know, in my instance, I mean, it comes into sharp relief. It's actually would be easier for me in a parish. But in a clinical environment, you know, where it's just one catastrophe after the other, and it's suffering and life and death, it's a matter of mediating that and finding the meaning in it. And what I often see is people trying to squeeze their experience and all of their anger and their defiance against the God they have been taught and indoctrinated with and define reality by, and fit this new painful reality into what they're supposed to believe about this all-knowing, all-loving, all-compassionate, all-merciful God. And I have found for myself, and I think I can suggest to people when it would be appropriate, that to not have to do that, to look at this experience from other than a theistic context frees you of all of that. And you can simply say, we don't know why this happened. It's some unfolding within nature, genetic or what have you, and we're busting our butts to find out how to arrest that, as we have in so many ways, that we sit here and, with sanitation and medical advances and electricity and all those things. I mean, the human mind can figure these things out, and we don't have anyone to blame. The universe is benign of malice, and it just is. It happened.
So this can help you do your job, you're saying?
I believe that, yes. And I'm already engaged with several other chaplains in the work of trying to further articulate what it is we do from a non-theistic platform. And insofar as individual subjects, people in the situation draw on their religious faith as a source of comfort for them, I'm there to say, go for it. How does that work for you? And use that. But I want to be able to eventually say to somebody when they ask me, so what is your faith? Or, what are your beliefs? To no longer have to hesitate, as I wouldn't as a Catholic or as a Presbyterian chaplain does. Well, they might say, well, I'm a Baptist or Presbyterian, but here, we're not functioning as that. I want to be able to say, I'm a humanist. And I think that will invite just what you said. I mean, there are very pregnant possibilities there for people to consider looking at things in a wholly different way.
Well, plus you get to go into the rooms where the person has indicated they have no belief, and you
Yes.
can arrive and say, so tell me about the God you don't believe in.
Yes.
Which is a great conversation starter a lot of the time.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe this is a good place to stop, and thank all of you very much for sharing. And I hope that, I know there are some humanist chaplains, and I hope that someday very soon you can walk in, and if they ask you that question, you can say, I'm a humanist. And let us know what the response is to that. And I want to open it up to questions in the audience, and you've all listened very carefully. And
Okay. Do we have any questions out here? So Tad, can you?
Test.
Hi, my name's Camille. My father was a United Methodist minister in Mississippi, and I have a feeling that he really was a humanist, but he surely came across as if he believed in the pulpit and that stuff, as if he believed in the Christian faith. I, by the way, am a Unitarian Universalist at this point. I'm curious about what I'm learning about theological school. And thinking about my dad, I believe he graduated from Emory in 1947 with his Master's of Divinity. I'm wondering, I was always under the assumption that he was indoctrinated in the Christian religion. Has this always been true that you're exposed to, even way back then?
even
Or
way
is this
back
more
then.
progressive?
No, even way back then. They had that information. They've had that information since the end of the 19th century, biblical criticism. And that's a good school that your dad went to. And I'm pretty sure that he learned academic Christianity.
I'm pretty sure he did too.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure he put up a front, but from the private questions I asked him, the answers were more from a humanist perspective.
It's what you were saying, you give the people the answer that they want to have. You don't give them what you learned in college because they're not ready for that. They can't take it, they don't want it.
When they asked Thomas Paine more or less what was his religion, and he said, the world is my church and my religion is to do good. And even until his death, he was hounded even on his deathbed to ask if he would recant. In other words, the priest wanted him to take up God and Jesus. But the thing that's so interesting about a man like that is that when George Washington was about to take his troops into battle, he didn't call upon a priest or religious person to come to give a good word to his troops. Getting ready to die, he asked Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine came, and he's the one that said, these are the times that try men's souls, you see. So you have to think about what the practical reality of something that is way out there of something that is right here. So as I was listening to what you were saying, I think one of the conversations I would have, I used to do a Bible study for about 13 years here at St. Philip's, and I would see Father Wint sometimes in the morning, and we used to have a joke, and I used to say, Father, I've never had any trouble with God and the devil. It's always been the people. So it's a more practical approach, and I think that he, no matter how you're serving as a priest or a rabbi, I think that all of these considerations are faced at one time or another. Even those who follow through with the liturgy and who are saying it, who are going through the motions of suffering it every day. I think that's the greatest suffering, at least as great as being crucified. I think that's a form of it. When you're going through something, you know you don't particularly believe in all of it, but you're afraid to have issues about whether or not you're going to stay out. It's a terrible crisis.
Thank you.
My question is primarily for Linda. I'm assuming you've had some direct involvement with Jerry DeWitt or Teresa McBain.
Yes.
Have you ever had any involvement with Greta Vosper?
Yes, I have. And you have a question beyond that?
She kind of seems unique in the fact that she's openly come out as an atheist, but she wants to remain a minister with her church, and they're trying to, I guess the people above her are trying to kick her out.
To give people some background, Jerry DeWitt and Teresa McBain were both ministers, active ministers at the time, and they participated in my study, and they had full confidentiality like everybody else in the study. But they came out very soon after I interviewed them, and they both gave me permission to say that they were in the study, and they always could speak about themselves being in the study. Greta Vosper, I've met since then. She's a member of the Clergy Project, and she's in Canada. She's an active minister of the United Church of Canada, which is like the United Church of Christ in this country. It's very liberal and open, but she's a little bit more open than most because she calls herself an atheist, and she's in church calling herself an atheist. And as she put it, I wrote about her in the blog, if you want to check out like the last week, I think. There's a big piece on her in the Toronto Star, just kind of laying out who she was. And, I've met her, I've talked to her. I don't know how she does it. I don't know how she gets away with it, but she does. And it's just recently that the United Church of Canada is saying they're going to come down on her and do something about her. But I don't think they're going to. They haven't up to this point. And she did not call herself an atheist until recently. But her beliefs are not any different than the beliefs of many other clergy in her denomination. She just says it aloud. And I'm glad that she does. I hope she gets to keep a congregation. I think she's got, incredible guts. Sometimes I think she's a little crazy for pushing it this far, but I'd like to see what happens with it.
Hi, my name is Kathy. You just said a word that opened up for me, and that was crazy. And I'm wondering how religion promotes mental health. And I think, for me anyway, this is an issue that needs to be addressed in our congregations, in all congregations, because we all are different, and we all do come from different backgrounds, and we all have had perhaps a dark journey. So the word crazy there just hit to me. So I want to, what is the role of mental health and religion?
And who are you asking? Anybody? Okay. That's quite a broad question. Is anybody else willing to take it on?
I think on the mental health side of it, I think that there are two realities to be involved with, and that is we are dealing with what we understand to be a natural world, or a medical situation that affects us physically. And then there's another world that we sometimes in our imagination think about whether it's supernatural or not. And I think sometimes to know what is right or wrong, we sometimes have to look at a broader picture and to understand that we can be okay, that we don't have all the answers, and to know when maybe we need to get more persons to talk with about this on a broader scale, doctor, priest, and broaden that out. I think that's the bigger part of it. And then number two, I think there's no shame in admitting or understanding that perhaps, I'm not quite thinking right about this. That's a hard thing to admit. I think to have a relative, I've talked with her and I've watched her for a while, and she doesn't seem to be quite right about this. And so sometimes I think that we want to address a nature that we say is a spiritual nature through what we've learned through maybe biblical understanding. But when we look at the same problems that those persons are having in the Bible, they're very much real and natural. And some of them are mental health issues also.
Yeah. Can I
Yes.
add something? Two things. I am no longer a licensed mental health professional, but I once was. I was a clinical social worker. And we were not really allowed, it was against professional ethics, to proselytize in any way about religion. But there are such things called, there's such a term as a Christian counselor, and they're often associated with churches. They may not have mental health, licensure and credentials. And they do counsel from a Christian point of view, and it can be a good thing or a bad thing. It depends on who you get. But there is an organization now that you may have heard of called Recovering from Religion. Does that ring a bell at all? Okay, they have a whole program now. They have a hotline for people who calling in who have been harmed by religion. And we're talking mainly about fundamentalists, really, because those are the people who are actively can be harmed by religion.
Exactly.
They have a hotline. They train people how to talk to people in distress. And then they have a system of referral to mental health professionals, psychologists, social workers from all over the country who are secular themselves and will take patients who need and want mental health counseling and are afraid to go to somebody because they're afraid they're going to be proselytized. Now, the chances of them being proselytized are actually very low unless they go to a Christian counselor. But they're so afraid of it that they want to know that the person they're talking to is not religious.
Right.
And it's sort of a shame that we've gotten to that point that we need that, but it's wonderful that that service is out there.
What I'm hearing from the three of you, well, let me just begin by saying not everyone cares about spiritual authenticity. Not everyone. Not everyone cares very deeply about connecting to other people, especially when they're in a lot of trouble and you are put in a position of having to really extend yourself to serve them. But what I'm hearing with the three of you is that all three of you care deeply about spiritual authenticity, though you may not always call it spiritual. And that all three of you care very deeply about connecting to other people when they need you, and that those people should trust you, and you should really be able to reach them. And I'm wondering if this is, since I've heard it from all three of you, I'm wondering if this is sort of typical, and if the people who maybe fall away in their beliefs maybe do have more of a real yearning for spiritual authenticity, and in some ways care deeply about that aspect of religion. And also, if it's typical that people who take this sort of a journey care really deeply about serving other people. And I think something about the poignant conflict that those two tensions and desires set up. If anyone wants to talk about that, I'd appreciate it. But.
Well, I would just say that I do know people who are parts of other religious traditions who are deeply compassionate, loving, generous people who practice their religion very close to the bone in terms of being of service to other human beings and being in right relationship to their God. So I couldn't really say, Mitch, that it's we apostates who are really the ones who've got it going on, because that's not true.
Yeah, I would agree with that and say that it's the kind of person who goes into the clergy in the first place that has the kind of attributes that you mentioned, and whether they change their beliefs or not, and whether or not they continue to believe in God or have supernatural beliefs does not affect that. They stay that kind of person. They're still that kind of person. And there are a lot of people who are clergy and believe in God who were not very nice people in the first place, and they're still not, and their religion gives them a reason to not be very nice, gives them a position of authority that they misuse. There was something I was going to do that I hadn't done yet, ask you what the pluses and minuses, the gains and losses that you experienced when you changed your religious beliefs. This is something that I asked the people in the study at the end of the interview series that I did with them, and they had talked all about their beliefs and their changes in beliefs. I said, what have you gained and what have you lost since your beliefs changed? And I was impressed with how quickly they were able to respond. How it was, although they hadn't talked about it in those terms, it was right on the top of their mind how they felt. And I'm hoping the same thing will happen here.
Well, I'd say courage, and
you gained.
And well, I think I gained courage. I think what I lost a lot was fear. And on that question about, I heard someone discuss a few minutes ago about they may ask you the question, what do you believe in? And I remember replying to someone one day when they asked me that, and I said, I believe in you, isn't that enough? And they said no. So when you hear something like that, we realize that sometimes in other people's lives, they need to know or to think that there's something greater, which I have no objection to. But I thought that answer was rather stark. I said, I believe in you. Isn't that enough? They said, no, it's not. So it's a very broad question as to what we say we believe or care about. And to look at one another and to say to that person, well, I really believe in you. Isn't that enough? And they say, no. Boy, I'm telling you. That really, it puts it in perspective for me. So I say courage, and in being able to say something like that to someone.
So that's what you gained.
Yes.
What have you lost?
Well, I think what I've lost to some degree maybe is some of the intimacy in relationships that are closer to me. Because even though maybe I haven't said directly about how I feel about religion, people have a good idea, when we get together for Thanksgiving and we want to pray and hold hands and all, they can sense that maybe you're not really into that. And in some traditions and some customs, it's kind of like, it's like groupthink. It's kind of like in Islam, I think, when they say, well, either you believe in what we do or we're going to kill you. So to some degree, you can be...
Some Islam is not.
Yes, some Islam. Excuse me, thank you so much. And even Christianity, if you don't believe, not falling in with us. So I think I have lost some sense of, I think, intimacy in that way. Because when relatives and friends know, well, he doesn't go to church, and he doesn't think this, or doesn't think that. And I don't think that's a negative, but I think I've lost something in that particular way.
Okay.
And you can professionally, too, and I'm relating to what he's saying. You can
And Jeanne,
feel
what have you gained and lost?
Well, what I lost first was I lost community. It was not so much, it was not about the creed or the doctrine.
Right.
It was about the practice and the community of support. And I lost that for 13 years until I had an experience of a healthy Unitarian church. So I gained, that's what I gained, was that I gained a place where the whole of me was invited in, including the part of me that is a lesbian, the part of me that thinks learning is a lifelong event, which, isn't always the case. I gained all that. I gained back a community plus.
I have lost the relationship with my original love, the church. In that Catholic, uniquely, crazy Catholic way. But what I have gained is the opportunity to continue the engagement with myself at the core of my being, and to continue taking things apart. And as in this case, I began taking apart my faith, and there's simply no putting it all back together again. I was always a kid, I liked to take things apart and figure out how they went back together. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. It's just to be really engaged in the dynamism of being alive and utilizing the gift of the faculty of reason, and just to follow that wherever it goes. And to not feel constrained by any external, imagined, supernaturally, or very real, hierarchically, authorities.
What I liked in conducting the study was the way people smiled, the way Tom is when they talked about what they had gained. Because they had lost a lot, and we had spent hours talking about it. But what they gained was so much more and so much more important to them. Is that a note on which to end?
We're back on here. Let me just say a couple of closing words. Anybody else have a last question? All right. So Sylvio, thank you. Oh, someone? All right, we'll do one more question, then we'll wrap it up.
We're saying that ministers tell people what they want to hear or what they can accept, rather than telling them the real story, the real history of Christianity and biblical history and so forth. When will they be ready to hear the real story? How can we bring this about, or are we doomed to always have it this way?
People should ask questions. It's an interesting thing about religion and science. They're direct opposites. Scientists want to know, if you have a question, yes, let's examine that. But in religion, if you ask a question, to some, that's a symbol of doubt or skepticism. So you have that parity to deal with. As I say before, the question for me is, do we really want an open discussion on the issues? I heard of a situation where a young man asked a pastor one day, I don't know how true it was, on the way out of church, "Pastor, why aren't there dinosaurs in the Bible?" And the reply, I understand, was, "We don't talk about those sort of things." So that's not the way to answer that question. And see, those are the kind of things that make you really think about, well, what is this about? Do we really want an open discussion on the issues? Ask the question. You should ask the priest, demand something from these priests, from these bishops. Ask them the question. Like the sister was talking about here, exorcism. I could not imagine myself being a part of an organization that could believe in such a thing. So no doubt she was troubled about some of the other kinds of things she began to learn. How do you reconcile all that?
And the other answer is, don't ask those questions in church. You can ask the questions, but if you want answers to them, don't ask them in church.
Yes.
Although there's difference. I mean, I know all churches are not like that, but...
Right.
We're not like that, but
Do you really want to know the answer? Do you think they really want to know the answer?
I want to put something on clergy generally, okay? Which is that if you're going to be clergy, you need to understand that courage is a requirement.
Yes.
And the call to the prophetic voice exists in all true religions. We would not be in this place if clergy historically had had the courage to stand up and ask the questions that Gary was mentioning. To some greater or lesser extent, clergy have led people to this place. All right? Because they were seeking approval.
I'm suddenly reminded of the Republican Party and what's happening right now.
Okay.
So I want to hold up that clergy have to answer to an ethical absolute, which is to honor truth as well as faith. And I just have to say, the state of religion and the hemorrhaging of people out of irrelevant bodies of religion is fomented in some case by the clergy, but also by lay leaders who want to control people's minds.
And it's also very hard work to have to think for oneself. And life is very complicated, and a lot of people just want to go to church and be comforted and soothed and palliated, perhaps, and they don't want to be challenged too badly and too rattled and too shaken, because then you have to think about that.
How do you follow Jesus, though, if that's the case?
Yeah.
I mean, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it seems obvious maybe to people who can't ever stop thinking about these things. And I've been doing that in my little congregation, which has never been more than 30 or so, and it's been gradually diminishing, to the point where I don't know if it's going to be viable for too much longer. And I don't know that that's the only reason, but,
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I just kind of wanted to follow up on his question. She kind of touched on it with the obligation to truth. It's just kind of presumptuous that you, like some people, I'm not accusing anybody here, would think that they can or cannot tell somebody the truth because they think it's not good for them. I mean, if it's just like holding back the information that my mother died just because you think it might, make me sad and wreck and change my life maybe. I think I had an onus to tell me that my mother died, and there's still plenty, I mean, if you've ever cried at the end of a movie, when, I don't know, like two lovers get back together or people pull together and do something, I mean, there's humanity in us that brings emotion out that we can all still get together and appreciate without a deity, and we experience it all the time. We don't have to have the deity. It's just unnecessary. That's all I had to say.
In my first pastorate, I gave a sermon sometime around the feast of, in Roman Catholicism, the feast of the Immaculate Conception.
August 8th.
Or December.
15th.
Oh, December.
December, yeah.
15th, right. Assumption is August 15th,
Yeah.
sorry.
And I talked around that topic, and of course I was looking at it from an Eastern Orthodox point of view in a Byzantine Rite Catholic Church under the Pope. And I said something to the effect that just because somebody says something is so doesn't make it so, referring to the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. I have a copy of a letter that was sent from a parishioner to my bishop that detailed a long list of abuses, things that I had said, things that I had done to offend their faith. And the copy I have, of course, and up in the corner of it was this little note, and it wasn't even sent to me by my bishop. It was sent to the one who was my spiritual mentor when I was in seminary, and he said, tell Father Thomas he needs to cool it, otherwise a suspension may follow, with his initials. So that was from the body of the faithful, who clearly, there was some voicing of like, he's telling us things we do not want to hear. So it works two ways.
So I want to thank all of the speakers. Sylvio Lynch, who's doing great work with the Secular Student Alliance, is going to be back here in August to talk about some of the special challenges that African Americans and Hispanics face when trying to leave religion behind. Thank you for the work. Look forward to hearing you again. Jeanne, as the minister here, thank you. You've been so welcoming to our humanist group, the talks that we have here about atheism, critical thinking, all the things, and it's amazing. I didn't know anything about Unitarianism until I joined the humanist group here, and so I'm really happy for you that you found such a good niche where you can be honest. Tom, it's incredible the courage that you're showing right now. One thing that I would mention is there's roughly 30% of the younger generation are nuns. So I know that you said it weighs on you, nuns meaning that they don't have a religious affiliation. So you said it really weighs on you heavily. How are the kids going to react? Robin Blumner, who's now the head of CFI and the Dawkins Foundation, mentioned that as she was growing up, she was an atheist. Her father didn't tell her till 20, 30 years later. A lot of the kids that are sick in those hospitals might find it very welcoming and refreshing to hear your honest take, to realize you're not religious. You have a big group out there that's going to welcome that. So, and Linda was probably too modest to really stress it, but aside from writing Caught in the Pulpit, she was very much behind with her kind of entrepreneurial spirit and following through on her own intellectual curiosity with contacting Dan Dennett, getting this book done, creating the Clergy Project, which gives people like Tom and people that want to minister, want to help people, but don't believe in the supernatural, a place to talk to each other. So if we can thank all of our guests, and thank you.